Welcome everyone to this webinar of the Linguistic Society of America. Today we have the next installment in our Meet the Author series, in which we feature authors who have recently had articles published in our journal language. Today we are pleased to welcome Tory Sampson, a doctoral candidate in the linguistics program at the University of California, San Diego, where she is also a student in the Cognitive Science Interdisciplinary Degree Program. And we welcome Rachel Mayberry, professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California, San Diego, and previous director of the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders of McGill University. They will present their paper, An Emerging Self, the Copula Cycle in American Sign Language. The presentation will be given in American Sign Language with interpretation. And so we also welcome Patty Lessard and Jojo Sullivan, who will be providing the interpretation. In this 90-minute webinar, our presenters will give a presentation for about an hour, after which they will respond to your questions in a Q&A session. You can submit your questions using the control panel on your screen. If you want to ask your question in person or in ASL, please indicate that in your question submission, and we will turn your camera on at the appropriate time so that you can ask your question. And so without any further ado, I turn the webinar over to Tory and Rachel.
Next slide, please. Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are coming from to our webinar today. I would like to begin with a brief explanation about our research and where this is all coming from. The challenge is for all researchers to find a research question. We always have curious people, curious about all kinds of things, but the problem is there are too many questions. There's a rule that I try to follow, and that is try to find some kind of language phenomenon, something maybe you don't quite understand yet. What we're going to talk about today is an example of this type of phenomenon. At the beginning, when Tory and I sat down and had a conversation about the different possibilities for our research question, I'm signing American Sign Language, as you can see, and that's what I was using when we conversed. And we noticed that there was a sign that kept appearing, and it was this hand shape that I just made, which refers to the sign for self. And we'd be having this conversation, and all of a sudden the sign would appear again, and quite frequently in our discourse. And of course, that got our attention to why is that sign there? And it felt like what we're going to call a heavy sign. It was connected somehow to classifiers because, you know, when we establish things, we have to set them up in our environment, and there's a certain weight to the sign when we do, and this sign felt like it had those attributes. We would see this sign appear, and of course, when it did, we'd have to stop what we were discussing and say, well, what did that mean? What's its function? Can we even remember what we just said that caused us to use this particular sign? And we noticed that it came up again and again, and we wanted to know what that sign was doing in our conversation. We wondered whether this sign was possibly functioning like a copula. And then we thought, well, no, on further studies, like that's not possible. Everybody knows that ASL doesn't have a copula. That can't be it. But it persisted. That sign would appear again and again in our conversation. So the presentation we're going to do this morning is about that journey, our discovery to find the function of this sign, self, in the structure of ASL. There was a lesson from our research that we learned, that there's also two types of linguistic knowledge. We know how to express the language. in this case, sign language. But you know, it's not the same thing to understand really the meta-analysis, the meta-structure of the language. Obviously, we don't really have time to talk about everything in our recently published paper, but this topic is something to look at, and you can see the full article in Language if you'd like to read it in total. Next, please.
So in these discussions that Rachel just mentioned with the sign self, we noticed that there were two distinct forms. There was the one-handed form, which looks like this. And you'll see the sign has an open A hand shape. And it usually has a double forward movement with a location in neutral space. This form also has a two-handed form, which you see here on the slide. That's self one because of the non-dominant hand in the one hand shape. So that is glossed as self one. And the dominant hand is tapping on the non-dominant hand. And in our research, in our analysis, these two forms do not seem to grammatically differ. They do not change syntactic structure, but they do seem to have different meanings. The one-handed form seems to be reserved only for human entities, while the two-handed form is able to be used with human entities, animal entities, concepts, things. So these signs, when we're referring to the sign self, we are actually referring to both variants that you see on the slide. Now, in our discussions in our linguistic analysis, talking about the function of self, we decided we really needed to unpack all of the analysis that had previously been done on this sign. So I will show you the three analyses that have been done previously on the next slide. Oh, one thing I do want to highlight is that the word self is not equivalent to the English words of myself, herself, yourself. These are concepts that are in English that are distinct to this sign in ASL. So this is something that we refer to as the tyranny of glossing. ASL is a sign language, and sign language linguistics research hasn't really agreed on how to uniformly record and gloss signs. And so this is a system that we use to use English words to label ASL signs. So the sign self, the word that I'm saying self, is a label and isn't actually a one-to-one matchup of the concept of self in the English language. So now let's go to the three functions of self in ASL in previous analysis. First, let's start with what I think if you asked a signer what the sign self meant, they're more likely to give you the English concept of the reflexive. So with the reflexive anaphor, it requires a verb, and that is because it has to show that the actor is doing something. If you see the example of the statement on the slide, he decided to force himself. Let's see that in ASL. So this is the reflexive form. Excuse me, the reflexive function. And the second function that you'll see that's often used in ASL discourse is as an emphatic. And this is for general discourse level emphasis, excuse me. So it really individuates an entity. And you can see the example statement on the slide. I love steak myself. I'm not saying I love steak just like my other friends do, but I love steak myself. So emphasizing that he is the person that really loves steak. And the third function, which is similar to the emphatic but has a slight different, this is as an intensifier. And as I said, it varies a little bit from the emphatic because it is pronominal, which means it's referring to the person. If you can see the example sentence on the slide, he knows he has Parkinson's disease. This doesn't mean that somebody else has Parkinson's disease. No, this person knows that they have. This is not referring to any other possible entity, but referring to that same person. We'll see an example in ASL on the slide. So those three functions that have been previously analyzed, but we felt in the course of our discussions that there were a lot more, and that didn't seem to specifically describe one structure that we were seeing frequently in ASL with the sign self. An example of that type of statement is on the slide. I'm going to sign the statement. I think Batman is Bruce Wayne. In that sentence, it is not grammatically acceptable if you use the index instead of the sign for self. It's not grammatically acceptable if you use a head nod or a null copula. So if we look at the three functions that we previously discussed, is it functioning as a reflexive? No, because there isn't a verb. Batman's not doing something to himself. So it's not a reflexive. The second function was as an emphatic. And when meeting with ASL consultants and asking if they thought the function seemed emphatic, and the response was no, because if there was an emphatic meaning, there would be a change in the speed of the sign, in the sharpness of the sign, in the production of the sign, in the non-manual markers when producing the sign. And we don't see any of those things in this sentence. So it's not functioning as an emphatic. And the third function that we previously discussed was as an intensifier. But again, there's no verb and there's no individuating that is happening. It's not functioning as an intensifier. So what we believe it's functioning as is as a copula. So now I would like to show you some examples of similar types of sentences with the sign self. You can see in this example, Zoe is functioning as the subject. 14-year-old tech genius is the predicate. And self is functioning in the sentence as a way of showing that the 14-year-old tech genius is describing Zoe. Let's look at another example. And here we can see the subject, Lester Holt, who is another human referent. Also the subject of the sentence. A journalist is his occupation, which is a noun. And again, self as functioning in between those two statements as saying that Lester Holt is a journalist. And now in this third example, we're seeing that the subject is no longer a human entity and is now a more abstract noun. And free is an adjective. So again, self seems to imply that free is describing the event. So these types of examples of self we see frequently in ASL, but the previous analysis don't really account for these uses.
Also now, the next and important question to ask is, what is a copula? How does it function? Is it different? Are they all the same in ASL?
Well, first, let's talk about, do all languages have copulas? Some languages have none. Some languages heavily rely on copulas. So it is a spectrum that we see with languages. But the copula functions, all linguists do not agree on the functions of a copula. They tend to be overlapping, and we'll discuss some of the functions that have been agreed on previously. So there's two types of expressions, one being an identity expression, which is what we saw in the example of I think Batman is Bruce Wayne. So A is B. Batman is Bruce Wayne is Batman. It's the same person, it's the same thing. It's an identity statement. The second statement is class membership. An example of that would be Superman is a hero. So Superman belongs to the set of people who are heroes. Superman is one of those heroes. He's a member of the class of heroes. So copulas are used strongly to express those type of statements. As we've previously mentioned in examples, the sentences usually have subjects and predicates, and sometimes the predicate cannot stand alone. So a copula serves as a linker to give support between the subject and predicate. So it's functioning as a linker to bring the two together. And based on literature reviews of spoken language, copulas have been described as something called a syntactic hitching post for verbal inflection categories, such as tense, aspect, and modality. In sign languages, those categories are encoded differently than in spoken languages, which means, would we expect copula functions to be the same in sign languages? Definitely needs more research, but something to keep in mind. And as previously mentioned, there are some words or phrases that are unable to stand alone as predicates. And that is where the copula provides support. And those predicates are usually lexemes that are the least dynamic, transitive, transient. So examples of that are usually nouns, because their forms stay the same across time and space. They're not actions, they're not events, they're more concrete, more temporally immutable. So that is why it requires copular support to be something.
So now I understand what a copula looks like, but what is the function? And where do they come from? Is that something that is there in the beginning of the language, or does it develop as the language does? Where do they come from?
Right? Things don't just appear out of nowhere. They have to have a cycle, a development. So through some analysis, we found a grammatical pathway that is referred to as the Copula Cycle. Katz in 1996 describes the Copula Cycle as follows. First, it's a thing that's never existed at some point, but that lexeme functions at first as dices. So that means that it is a lexeme that is showing something that is rooted in the physical context. So we usually think of words like there or this, or in ASL, the index or point. So at this point, the lexeme then develops and evolves into a demonstrative. And at this stage, again, this is the equivalent to what in spoken English would be this or that, which is different than when it was deisis, because as a demonstrative, it can be rooted in linguistic context. So you can chat with somebody about a certain topic, and the next day you can say, remember this. And this refers to the linguistic context of the previous day and not anything rooted in physical context. So that is the function as a demonstrative. And then at this point in the cycle, the next stage is the word can become a pronoun. So it's functioning as a referential marker to things or an idea or entities. And then if it continues in the cycle, it will later become a copula at the final stage, which is a linker of symmetrical relationships. A is B, A is a member of B. And then eventually, with time, a copula can become cliticized, at which point it fades and returns to non-existence and the copular cycle. Languages will sometimes replace a copular item with another copular item or with a null structure that might take over completely. So we see languages that go through this cycle and any copulas in language that have gone through this cycle.
All right, so if other languages have this copula cycle, does ASL have it? The same cycle?
I mean, that's the real question here, right? So where did we start? So of course, we wanted to look historically, looking at the old French Sign Language. And I want to be clear that the reason we did that is that LSF is a predecessor of American Sign Language. In the 1810s, there was a French educator who was brought to America and with the goal of establishing deaf schools and deaf education. And that is why there is such a huge role that LSF plays in ASL. So we were looking for sources for old LSF. We were able to utilize the Historical Sign Language database. And there were 2 old French Sign Language dictionaries. We were able to search manually for entries through one. And I was looking specifically for signs that had 2 qualifications. I realize the coloring is a little bit off, but it's the open A hand shape. That's what we were looking for, the open A hand shape, because that's the hand shape of the ASL sign for self. And the second was for anaphoric references. And the reason I did that was that self functions so strongly as a reflexive. Herself, myself, their selves. I wanted to see what that had in common. So I found 3 entries that I thought were relevant that I would like to show you. This is the first person singular pronoun. So referring to the signer. So the signer points to themselves to refer to themselves, which makes sense. And that's a very common first person singular sign cross-linguistically in sign languages. And for the second person singular, which would be the equivalent for English you, it's an outward point, which makes sense. The signer is now pointing to the perceiver to refer to them, which is common cross-linguistically. So what would we expect for a third person singular pronoun? This is a novel sign, a novel hand shape. It's not following the pattern with the one hand shape. This now has the open A hand shape, and you see an over the shoulder movement instead.
So my next question would be, why is it that form and that hand shape? And how did that function in LSF?
I had the same question, Rachel. Why? Why do we see this open A handshape? And Fisher in 1996 pointed out that historically, the French sign for the number 1 was an open A handshape. And that open A handshape was also a person classifier. We still see vestiges of that in modern ASL signs, such as, these are 3 examples I'll show you. Can see clearly that these 3 signs incorporate the relationship between 2 entities. For example, with the chase, you can see there's one person physically chasing the other person. Or with assist, there is another person pushing up or assisting. And we see vestiges of this in other signs like with, together, with each other, challenge, superior. So that brings me back to why this is the form for third person singular pronouns. And we suspect and we propose that this is actually historically a compound or a blend of 2 signs, which is the person classifier, the open A handshape, and a locative point. So you could imagine in the 1800s as an LSF signer in a conversation with another signer, and you wanted to speak of the baker that has a bakery a little bit north of where you happen to be having the conversation. You can imagine saying the baker, and then pointing in the direction of the baker and seeing that the person classifier and the locative point through phonetic fusion would become this third person singular pronoun. The locative point, which we see in many emerging sign language, which we've seen documented in Nicaraguan sign language, in Calaculic sign language, which is another village sign language. You see people in Indonesia, excuse me. So we see often people with emerging sign language using this locative point. And with time, the locative point loses its physical context and becomes rooted in linguistic context. So this is showing 2 stages of the copular cycle. It's showing the dices, which is based on the historical reconstruction of the compound or blend, and then the demonstrative stage as well.
So that means we have an awful lot of information and more questions. If the copula cycle is active in ASL, then we should see it there. And we should expect to see, for example, self as a pronoun, the old ASL form, and it's also there in present day ASL as an item.
Exactly. And to test these 2 hypotheses, we decided to undergo a corpus study. So to test the first hypothesis with self functioning as a pronoun in Old American Sign Language, we looked at, which is pretty great, again, the historical sign language database. They have a repository of black and white films that were commissioned by the National Association of the Deaf. And these videos were commissioned in the 1910s to the 1915s. And those videos, most of the signers are 2nd or 3rd generation signers. And at the time, ASL is about 100 years old. They're already coded and glossed in the database. So our task was to search for the key term self. We found a total of 86 instances by 9 signers. This was a really valuable opportunity I want to highlight, because self, as part of the syntactic context, we're really able to also code their syntactic function, which is really a rich thing to be able to do with data. So there are 4 functions. Pronominal. So this, if there is a verb showing that self is referring to someone. Emphatic. So this is when it's used for the discourse level emphasis. Reflexive. This is when showing that someone is doing something to themselves. And a copular function, which is when the predicate is a noun or adjective. And we will show the coding schema and give you a moment to look at it. So you can see the types of structures that we saw in the old ASL data. So we were able to get a total of each category, and you'll see that result here on the slide. The data shows clearly that almost 80% of the functions of self in old ASL were as a pronoun, which confirms the first hypothesis that yes, it is functioning as mostly as a pronoun. We'll see an example from the video. I'm wondering, I don't think you can see the bottom. Darn it. I think the gloss is cut off from the English sentence, but if you could see that, the main verb is wonder. And so that shows that self is functioning as a pronoun and referring to President Lincoln in the sentence. So this is functioning as a pronoun. And again, as we saw in the data, that's the use of the sign self was functioning as a pronoun 80% of the time, which shows that old ASL was in the pronoun stage of the copular cycle. Now, the second hypothesis is self functioning as a copula in modern American Sign Language. So to answer this, we conducted a small corpus collection. We looked at the National Corpus of Sign Language and Gesture Resources. They had data from the early 2000s, the early 2010s. We also looked at publicly available videos on Facebook, on YouTube. We looked for any instances of self, regardless of function. And that data was from the late 2010s. In total, we had 100 instances of the sign self. There were a total of 18 signers of different cultural linguistic backgrounds. And the coding schema we used with old ASL, we used again, but the variety of structures differs in this schema, and I'll show you that on the next slide. It's an interesting observation. We saw with old ASL quite the variety of structure, but this is showing a little bit more uniformity and standardization of structure, which shows the evolution in the age of ASL. So in total, out of the 100 instances of self, we saw a little bit more than 70% of the function in modern day ASL as being copular. And this was using the same standards of coding and the same schema as with old ASL. And when we see both of them on screen, we can see the dramatic shift from the function in old ASL as a pronominal to the copular function in modern ASL. It's very apparent. And let's look at some example sentences. This is an example of an identity statement. This woman is being explained as the woman who is coming to present to the university, and then her name is given, Dr. Maria Copula. Oh, get it? See why I picked this, Dr. Marie Copula? So again, this statement is A equals B. Dr. Marie Copula is the woman that's coming to present. So let's watch this example. And another example, this is a class membership. So Junior NAD, which is the Junior National Association for the Deaf, is a unique referent, a non-human entity. And it's being shown to be a member of a set of things that are a location. And here you can see the gloss that is IX, which is the gloss for index, which is a pronominal point. And that provides even more evidence that self is not functioning as a pronoun because the pronominal point is already functioning as the pronoun. So let's see. That video is a little choppy, but hopefully you can see the production clearly. So these were both examples that really show the copular stage of ASL. The ASL is in the copula stage of the Copula cycle. So over the course of 150 years in ASL linguistic history, it seems that it has gone through all the stages from deisys to demonstrative to a pronoun to a copular function.
So we have seen that ASL does have or follows the copula cycle, which leads us to the next important question. What actually produces or drives that copula cycle? I mean, what makes that cycle happen?
We have our cognition to thank for that, actually.
Nope.
So copulas, the development of copula is driven by really minuscule changes in syntactic structures. This drives people to interpret things slightly differently. So let's look specifically at three different structures first. Let's talk about topic comment. So the topic comment structure happens when a language has no copulas, or also a null copula language. Lee and Thompson published seminal work showing in Mandarin, which is a Chinese language. So let's look at some examples for Mandarin. So here we have the topic, a person's name, Wang Tai, and we have a comment, outstanding person. And at the end, there is a declarative particle. So that informs the perceiver that the sentence is complete. So when the perceiver hears the declarative particle, they then know to go back to look for a verb. If there is no verb, then it is a null copula that's inserted between the topic and comment. So we know that Wang Tai then belongs to the set of outstanding people. So that's a null copula clause. So let's see if we can find examples of that in Old ASL. I'm realizing that my glossing on the bottom is not showing up as well, but I will do my best to read it to you. So the Dune family is the topic. Class noble is the comment. And you can see in between, there is a null copula. And when we watch the video, you can see the signer spells the Dune family, then has a head nod, then signs class noble with a quick head nods at the end. So these are phrasal boundaries that the nod is linking and highlighting. So let's look at the video. So again, we saw the head nod to show that it was the end of the topic, and then the head nod at the end to show the end of the statement, the sentence, which is very common for a topic comment structure. But this type of structure is not easy for the perceiver. It actually requires the perceiver to put in a lot of work, and it's a heavy cognitive load to try to figure out the statement. So that's where, because of the cognitive load, we see a topicalized structure start to emerge. So here's the example on the slide from Mandarin again. So the topic is poverty and debasement. Then there is the pronoun she, which has a falling tone, and that is referring to the topic. And then the predicate has the ye, which is the declarative particle at the end of the sentence, which lets the perceiver know the sentence is complete. There's still no main verb in the sentence, as you see, but now the perceiver has an easier time accessing the topic because of the she. So it's less of a cognitive load, and it's showing more phrasal cohesion. So it's helping the perceiver know where the boundaries are, where the boundaries cross. So let's give now an example of a topicalized statement in ASL. This will be with a verb in the sentence, just to be aware. In this sentence, fair is the topic. So you will see the eyebrow raised to emphasize the topic. And then for the rest of the statement, you'll see the eyebrows return to a neutral position. The fair, this is a verbal phrase. So the self is functioning as a pronoun as expected. So you can see the eyebrow raise on fair, and that's an important non-manual marker, a grammatical non-manual marker that shows topicalization. Now for another example where there is no verb phrase. And again, we would expect that the eyebrows, to be raised on alcohol because it is the topic. And we see that in this sentence, self is functioning as a pronoun, referring to the subject, and the predicate, because there is no verb, has a null copula. So let's see the video example. But wait, there's a second possible interpretation here. Again, I'm not sure that you can see the gloss, but I will go ahead and read it. So ASL also allows for null pronouns. So it's possible that in the second interpretation of the statement, alcohol is functioning as the topic, but that then there is a null pronoun and that self is functioning as a copula with the predicate to give support to the predicate. So these are two possible interpretations of the sign self, and we call this flicker mode. So this is something we refer to when the perceiver has a possible interpretation that can exist, but there's also another interpretation that is coexisting but shouldn't. And this is important because this is what leads to language change. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. So thanks to the head preference principle, which means that people prefer to interpret things as heads of syntactic phrases. And I'll give you a syntactic tree as a visual. So you can see the S is for the sentence. It has, and then it breaks down to topic and then comment. But that comment can also be its own sentence, which is what the second S you see in the tree. And that can have a pronoun, a copula, and a predicate. And because ASL allows for both a null pronoun and a null copula, self can really function either as a pronoun or a copula in either positions. But because the perceiver prefers to interpret all words as head, this head preference principle, that is the leftmost node, if you see on the diagram. So that is the copula position in the diagram. So the copula position in the predicate phrase. So over time, over use, because of this principle, perceivers prefer to perceive it as a copula and not a pronoun. So through time and through language change and reinterpretation of topicalized structure, that is where we see this copular structure and it becoming this pure copular structure with no phrasal boundaries. It really just being one complete sentence with copular structure. And we'll see an example of that in Mandarin on the slide now. So you see, instead of a topic, it's a subject. And again, you see she as a copula, and the rest is the predicate. And this is obligatory for nouns in modern Mandarin. And we can see this change in ASL as well. The signer in this video is expressing this sentence without any pausing, without any topicalization, non-manual markers. Again, you didn't see any eyebrow raise from the signer. We didn't see any topicalization. It was just one sentence without any of those markers. Now, research begets more research, begets more research, as good research should. So, of course, we have more questions because of all this. So we're seeing that the majority of the use of the sign self was in a news report scenario, where we had one person telling news or announcements, as opposed to narratives, where we saw much less use of self. So that seems to say something in regards to what is it? It conveys something. Is it something informational as opposed to a narrative structure? Is it something about experience or beliefs? Do we express that differently, maybe? And there's no data as far as self and two-person conversation or dialogue. And that might be great ground to recognize something different. Maybe when showing or teaching another person, I use the sign self more than when I'm telling another person a story or a narrative. And in our corpus study, we also found a strong relationship with the increased use of self with nouns versus adjective. We saw it 57 times with nouns versus 15 times with adjectives, which made us wonder why. We wondered if ASL, because some languages do look at adjectives or treat adjectives as more verbal than nouns, maybe ASL is one of those languages. So that's a topic for future research. And this is a recurring question that comes up in conversations between me and Rachel. This sign self seems optional. It's never obligatory when you're using copular clauses. That means that ASL still has a null copula. So what is the difference? Why do we use self versus a null copula? When do we use one versus the other? So these discussions are still ongoing and definitely topics for future research as far as the syntax of ASL.
So why is this research important? Well, you could say we found linguistic structure that's different from what we thought. We have a linguistic theory perspective of how important it is. We're looking at the syntactic structure of ASL because that helps us understand what is similar or different. If we're looking at languages of two different modalities, we have the modality of a spoken language, the modality of a signed language. And we see the syntactic structure is similar, even though the modalities are radically different. So that indicates to us that this process of grammaticalization, for example, the Copula Cycle, is what encourages the cycle happening in spoken language, but also in sign languages. So the modality does not seem to be the importance. The other reason this is important is because we need to understand more about the linguistic structure of ASL. Especially when you think about teaching deaf children, we want them to become bilingual. We see the copula in ASL. What does it look like in English? Can we do a comparison of these two languages so the students become proficient in two languages, written English as well as expressing themselves in ASL? It's also important for interpreters. They need to know the structure. They need to know the structure of ASL assigned language so that they can interpret things correctly, and also for their own comprehension, how they understand deaf people who are signing to them. And also to understand more about children and their language acquisition. The copula is an important part of sentence structure. So now we're looking at how children acquire ASL, and we see what other kind of linguistic knowledge do they have in addition to the linguistic structure and the copula. So that's where we're looking at providing a very rich background for future research. We're looking at the different applications of the syntactic structure.
Just going to give everyone a chance to read what's on the slide too.
And finally, I think one thing that's really an important part about our research is we're looking at sign language change or shift, or how it develops? And what about the newly formed sign languages, for example, Nicaraguan Sign Language? But it's obvious to us that sign language continues to change. It continues to add more complication and structure, more complexity, which I believe reminds us it's not just the new sign languages that change, but all languages change. All signed languages change.
I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank a lot of people. First, I want to thank all the signers and the deaf community who participate in this research, because without them, this research isn't at all possible. I want to thank the Mayberry Lab, to all the ideas and all the thoughts and all the feedback. And it's just great that we were able to distill all of these ideas to this one core idea that came out of it. I also want to thank the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program for supporting me in my research. I also want to thank very important source of historical data, two of them. The first one being the Historical Sign Language Database, and that is thanks to Dr. Ted Copula at Georgetown University. And then the National Center of Sign Language and Gesture Resource, which is run by several universities, Boston University, which is my alma mater, Rutgers University, and it's led by Dr. Carol Neal. So I want to thank her for that. And obviously the NIH also supported a grant that also supported this research. So thank you. Now, if you have any questions or comments that you didn't have the opportunity, so also feel free to email us if they weren't asked in the chat. So I think we'll stop our screen sharing and commence the Q&A. Let me just look at the questions. So we just click on questions on our control panel, just letting Rachel know so she can see them too. Have you seen it yet? Okay. Well, I see, I can read one. Well, do you see where it says webcam and questions right above, between questions and chat, in case you want to see the questions, Rachel? So I'm going to read. Carol Padden asks, have you looked for the appearance of copulas in young signing children? What would you predict based on what we know about young speaking children's use of copula? So with our most recent thoughts and discussions about the use of the sign self, I suspect that when signers use that sign in discourse and conversation, rather than conveying their belief or their opinion, it's more of it's a truth conditional. So it becomes verifiable. You can test whether a statement is true or false. For example, self is often used by by a teacher that might say, Greece, it is an island in the Mediterranean. So that's verifiable. You can verify whether it's an island or not. And that's where this use of the sign self in that statement. So I think with young children, where they're developing that that ability to distinguish between belief and facts. And so I suspect at a young age, I'm not sure exactly where in the development, but when that starts to distinguish is when the sign self will start to appear. But now when you're talking about self as a copula, as a reflexive, now that might appear as a different time versus a copula. Self as an emphatic, I would expect, might appear at a different time. So I think that depending on the function, it would appear at different times. And speaking of young children's use of copula, Becker in 2000, I believe it's 2000 is the year that was published, did studies on copular use. And it says it's often based on that the use comes later based on the distinction of belief versus fact, and that in that development of. Rachel, did you want to add?
Yes, I would like to add something here. And I think this is a very interesting question. And I think this is a good point for someone to take up and study, because if you're using self, it might be late because of a specific function, because there are different functions. You know, we have the classifier form, we have the reflexive form, and also we have the copula. So it's possible. I think we can't think about the one-to-one relationship between form and function at the beginning. I think we're going to have to be a little more flexible with the form and the words. So that's one possible hypothesis.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me just see if there's another question I can answer. There's a long question, so from John Powell. So I'm reading it now. So he says, my question relates to grammaticalization of self within the cycle. Please forgive me for any inaccuracies, but I remember watching Signing Black in America, and there was a discussion of how Black ASL retained the conservative two-handed negation, whereas the white varieties often use the one-handed negation, where the negator morphologically fuses with the main verb. Like don't want, don't like would be an example of that. This immediately struck me as an emerging negative cycle. You discussed self having two forms, one and two-handed. By chance, are there any indications that the one-handed version morphologically affixes or fuses or cliticizes to a neighboring element? If it did, we wouldn't be at all surprised, since copulas tend to grammaticize in these ways over time. I was just curious. Thank you, John. Thank you for that question. So I want to just add something that wasn't discussed in this presentation. The one-handed is the only form that was used in old ASL, while the two-handed form, excuse me, let me say this way, modern ASL uses both, though it is more the two-handed form. So when you're talking about criticization, which is when a sign becomes smaller, it becomes phonetically, phonologically reduced and fused with other signs. I do think that we see that happen with the non-dominant hand, the one hand. So I think there's examples. So the one-handed showing the entity, we usually use that with a verb, like you hit the entity, or you remind, or you kiss, or something is being done to it. So we're often seeing people fuse the point, the pronominal point, with the self. So we're seeing both. So I think that is conveying one aspect of how signers are, they're patterning their language. So I think that is a big form of criticalization that I see with that sign. And I've also seen rightward with self and then the rest of the predicate in the statement. But this is not standard, and this varies, and it often requires specific hand shapes that the open A doesn't merge with. There are some predicates that have the open A hand shape. Like, for example, saying someone is 10 years old. 10 is already the open A hand shape. So self 10, we kind of see this using, so we see that happen. I hope that answered your question. Great. I think it did. Okay, so we're going to look at Diane Lilo Martin, her question. I'm wondering about the existence of multiple functions of self. Do you think that we simply see multiple stages of the cycle at the same time, or should these different functions be collapsed into a single analysis? I think that's an interesting question. That's something that we have talked a lot about, and I think it's important to highlight that in the pronoun stage that we see in old ASL, that self is functioning also almost exclusively as a subject pronoun, whereas now we're not seeing that anymore. We're only seeing it as an object, a reflexive pronoun. So I think that really demonstrates this distinction in the functions of self. So now these functions are related, of course. So for example, cross-linguistically in spoken language, reflexives tend to then become emphatics. So those show a very strong relationship. Copulas, that because they come from the subject pronoun, so we see this where it breaks off the pattern. The object becomes the emphatic, the subject pronoun becomes the copula. But are those related in the same way? I hesitate. I mean, I actually say I beg to differ. But what happens in the signer's mind, maybe, the linguistic history, the function is different, but maybe in a signer's mind, they really are the same, and that's possible. Rachel, you look like you want to add something.
Yes, if I may. I think it's important for us to consider this type of process, language evolution, because we know this is true of all languages. They're not individuals. It's a collective. And I think it's important for us to think about the individual and the languages and look at all the different stages of this cycle, and then also look at the languages as on a holistic level. I mean, we have a language, and maybe through these cycles we might see some variability, and how over time things become more uniform or similar.
And I think it's important to note the influence of English.
Oh, yes.
Because, I mean, almost all deaf people are bilingual in ASL and in English in America. So it's undeniable to see the influence of mouthing. The signers say self when they sign self. And so that association with the English concept of self, and really maybe as an emphatic or reflexive, and what kind of influence that has, whereas what is really ASL and ASL function and structure. So, looking at that differently because of the influence of English. I think that's an ongoing challenge with the analysis of American Sign Language, but I think that's a great question, so thank you. So I have a question from Nina Shishmuna. I have to say hi.
Oh, Nina.
So you mentioned that there was a prevalence of copula in the news-like text, but not the narrations. Could it be related to genre difference? There is research that shows in Japanese, for example, that there are different copula distributions in different genres. I think that's an interesting point, Nina. I think it's always kind of the chicken or the egg question, right? So the news reports are, you know, there with the intention of distributing facts, whereas narratives is the intention to deliver a fact, not always. So I think the genre difference might be in intention or attitude or in, you know, like again, like news is this presentational, honorific type language, whereas a narrative is much more intimate. I don't know that that is what's happening. I think it's more of the informational structure. I think that the signers are trying to remove themselves in the news report. They're trying to remove their attitude, their beliefs, and their bias. And so by doing that, they use the sign self to neutralize and distribute facts rather than opinion. And I think that this comes up in ASL because it's because of constructed action. It's so common. Constructed action happens so much that signers are constructing the action while they're signing. So they are the characters in their narration. They are all the characters in their narration. So how do you distinguish yourself as the journalist or the reporter from the actors in the story? And you try and remove that and make it more like you're the narrator to the story and not a part of the story as the signer. So that's what I think when it comes to genre difference. I think that's what this is highlighting. I think it is because of the informational structure that results in that difference. Wilkinson in 2013, AB, did some research on genre differences with self and noticed that with monologues, vlogs, news, I believe as well, had a very similar number of instances of self as opposed to narratives that had much less. So monologues, you know, where you're really giving a lot of information, and we saw a lot more use there than narratives. So yeah, I think there's something to do with the informational structure. Okay, let me see. I think there's another question from Linda Cundy. What do we think about the way we're changing signs in ASL to avoid finger spelling and initialized signing? I'm not sure how that relates specifically with the use of self. That might just be a general question, but since it's been asked, I think for people maybe who aren't aware with the recent context of the community of ASL users and signers, I think recently there's been more signers being aware and resistant to the use of the representation of English in the use of ASL, which would be finger spelling, or also what is being referred to as initialized signs, which is when you represent the letter of the English word that you were signing by using the letter. Some people view that as being oppressive to American Sign Language, and it is showing a bias to the dominant language of English. So there has been people who have felt that that's something that they should be resistant to. Do I think that's really impacting the evolution of language right now? I don't. I can't say that I do. I think that there are people who don't know the functions of self and will still use it, and in these ways that we're analyzing without really understanding maybe the linguistic structure, but most signers, so I don't think that would have a big impact. Okay, so I'm going to look at J. Albert Bickford, had an interesting observation. Says, perhaps minor observation. I have seen the open A handshake used as a pointing sign that looks very much like the drawing from Old French Sign Language. The context was two people sitting side by side. One person was talking about the other person. In that situation, obviously, an ordinary index would be physically awkward, so the signer pointed at the thumb at the person next to her. So that might be a rare perseverance of the LSF. And I agree, I've seen that, especially with covert context. A lot of, hey, hey, them over there. So I have seen that sign. So I think that that's in specific context, specific physical context, is a robust form that we would have as like that we would cite in an ASL dictionary versus what we saw in old LSF, which was a robust sign that was being used. There wasn't another option. It wasn't like there was an over-the-shoulder point and over-the-shoulder open A and the point. There was only the over-the-shoulder A for your third-person pronoun. So I think that's where we see this as a really robust and prominent sign. Saliko, I'm sorry if I say your name is Salikoko. Would you like to ask your question? I have to unmute 1 second, and then the interpreter will interpret.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead.
The distribution of the copula as you describe it in ASL reminds me of the distribution of the copula in African American English. More uses of the copula with the predicative noun phrase, fewer with adjectives, and fewer with prepositions. But there is something that you didn't talk about. In the past tense, the copula is required in African American English. And in questions, the copula is also more frequent. So while you can say he tall, the question should be, is he tall? Have you investigated that in the context of American Sign Language?
Well, that's a great question. So the difference between a sentence and an interrogative, the corpus has some instances of self being used in statements that are sentences that are questions. And it's interesting, it was used like the primary function when it was in the form of a question was to function as almost like the concept of is. But with our analysis, we didn't see questions very often. Sentences were usually what we saw. And I think, again, that goes back to the structure of the information that's being shared. You can use a null copula to receive the answerers, their belief or their opinion. And the answer can use self instead to say, no, 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 this is more of a fact, not just an opinion. Or they cannot use self, it's optional, to convey that they are, it's really their thoughts or beliefs about the answer.
I would like to add something, if I may. If we're looking at tense in ASL, and you're a little fuzzy, Rachel, after you said tense, what did you spell? An aspect. Thank you. Tense and aspect. In the sign itself, as the copula, it doesn't carry the tense and aspect. So that way, the copula in ASL is different in how it functions in English. So maybe you're saying the copula in English also has several functions, and one of them is to carry tense and aspect, involving questions as well.
Yeah, with sign languages, they encode tense aspect differently than with spoken languages. And that's one huge area of research, needed research. So for self as a copula to be able to carry tense and aspect, that's something that would still to be determined.
Yeah.
But I wanted to also add too about what you mentioned about African American English. So I did notice there was a study, and darn it, I wish I remembered the name of the author, but they were looking specifically, I think it was Becker, that looked at categories of when African American English speakers use copula statements the most, and they noticed that when the predicate was a noun or when it was showing stative properties, so they were showing properties that are static over time, African American English speakers are more likely to use is, a copula, as opposed to a predicate that is more eventative, like words like available, busy, free, down. You're less likely to use the copula as an African American English speaker. And we do see that same pattern in ASL. We see that with the predicates that are more, what we would call more permanent, more immutable, less dynamic. We see that more often with the sign self. So we see nouns more often with the sign self than we see adjectives.
Actually, where you may want to look is also English Creoles, because of the reason that Patty just articulated, whether or not the copula is expected to carry tense and aspect, because in Creoles, the morphosyntax is isolating. And so the marker of tense is a phemorpheme, and the patterns of the distribution of the copula are going to be very similar to what you just described for American Sign Language. Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you.
I'm trying to make sure I got all the questions, make sure I didn't miss anybody. I think that's it.
Wonderful.
So thank you everybody for coming and watching our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Tory Sampson and Rachel Mayberry for an amazing presentation, and thank also Jojo Sullivan and Patty Lassard for interpreting for us, and thanking you all for joining us today. You should receive in the next day or so a follow-up email with information on the video recording of this webinar, and also on information on joining the LSA if you are not a member and are interested in that. Once I end this webinar, it will end somewhat abruptly for all of us, participants included. So I just want to say thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And bye-bye.